In this video, we'll be going over more advanced tracking tips and tricks, coming right up.
The wild Elsa, found in its natural snowy habitat, is a fierce creature. They are said to possess the ability to control the weather whenever they get upset, which is a lot. Now, here is your host, some woman named Elsa.
Hello and welcome to EcoElsa. If you're new to my channel, my name is Elsa and I make videos to help people get outdoors. In this video, we'll be going over some tips and tricks to help you learn some more advanced tracking techniques that'll help you determine a couple of things about the animals that you're tracking. For starters, their size, how fast they were moving, and how long ago they left their prints behind. So let's get started. Additionally, just a reminder, if you are new to tracking outdoors, I have another video on the basics of tracking outdoors to help you identify animal tracks before you get into these more advanced topics. So check that out in a link in the description below. So for starters here, we're going to be discussing how you determine the size of an animal based on its trail. So we have found a deer trail here that is fairly fresh from this morning, and I've set up a tape measure so that we can get a rough idea of about how long this deer is. What helps with this is having a tape measure, because some of the animals you'll be measuring might be pretty long. Now, for starting out when you're learning this technique, it usually is easier if you do it with mid-sized animals to larger animals. So things like deer all the way down to coyote, fox-size, cat-size animals. Anything smaller than a cat, and it ends up being pretty hard to determine roughly its size and its weight. You can still do it, it's just you're working with much smaller numbers. And a lot of the animals that are smaller than a cat move in such a way that it makes it very hard to measure the length of the animal because they're doing a bounding motion. What I've measured is I've measured the full back foot and then the full front foot. It's really important when you're doing this to make sure you're not measuring the drag, because if you measure the drag, you're actually adding on length to the deer or whatever the animal is that you're tracking, because that's not the actual footprint. Now this deer was moving a little bit faster than I initially thought. Once I got a look at the prints, I realized that it was doing a thing called direct registry. We talked about this in a previous tracking video. It's when an animal, usually a deer, a fox, or a cat, is moving, and they're moving at such a nice, even pace that their back feet are landing perfectly in the front feet's footprints. So it makes the animal look like it was walking with 2 feet. And that's what you see here when you look at this set of prints. So what I've measured is the full back foot. So I have the 0 mark at the edge of that back foot. And then I've measured up to the toes of the front foot over here. And so the deer was a little over 6 feet long, it looks like. Now that may seem a little bit long, but you have to remember, we're measuring length here. Most deer, height-wise, they only come to about 2.5 feet at the shoulder or 3 feet at the shoulder. So this is an animal that has very long legs, and so they use those long legs when they're moving. So since it was moving at a faster pace, it might actually be a little bit shorter than this measurement, but this is well within the range of a white-tailed deer, because white-tailed deer can be up to 7 feet long, sometimes occasionally a little bit longer. So next we're going to look at the straddle of the deer prints. So if I'm looking at these deer prints across, there isn't a whole lot of environmental factors here. It's pretty open, and it makes it hard to determine the size of the deer for width. So the straddle of the footprints is about 1 foot wide. This deer is probably about that width, maybe a little bit wider, or maybe not even quite wide enough if it is a doe and she is with fawn at this point in winter. So what's important to do is also to look at other environmental factors for the same trail of prints. It's important to look at more than one set, because as I follow this trail, I might be able to find broken branches or things that will help me determine the size of the deer and maybe the height of the deer as well. So the third thing to talk about is the depth of the prints. And since these are a very fresh trail of prints, they're probably from this morning, if not later last night. It's very fluffy snow that came in yesterday, hence why we're out here to track today, because we'll get more clear prints. But in this case, the deer's legs went so deep in that the legs were dragging and it got filled in with more snow, as you can see here. So it's going to make it really hard to determine what the deer's weight was, or a rough estimate, but something to keep in mind is what's really easy to do is to think about how much you weigh, and then when you take a footprint, if it's a fairly fresh print, you can compare how deep your foot it goes in compared to the deer's. Now something to think about is we're bipedal. We're putting a lot more weight on our 2 legs than an animal that's spreading their weight across 4 legs. But deer have a lot smaller foot than we do, so it's more sharp, it goes more through the snow, it doesn't quite balance on top of the snow as much. So that means that in the case of humans and deer, roughly we're on even ground there. I have the same surface across my 2 legs with my big feet that a deer has across their 4 feet with their smaller hooves. So since I'm seeing that it looks like for the most part the prints are higher up in the snow than my feet are when I took a step and I looked at it, that means that this deer is most likely lighter than me. Some tips to keep in mind when estimating the size of an animal is making sure that the animal prints that you're gauging the size based on is when that animal is walking or trotting. Because if an animal is moving at faster speeds, there's going to be a larger gap in between the prints because they're putting more force into the ground to propel themselves forward. So it may make the animal seem to be longer or larger than it actually is. For number 2, we'll be estimating how fast an animal was moving. Now to estimate speed, you need to learn the basic movements that the animal you're tracking moves at. So for example, a deer can move at a walk, they can move at a trot, and then they can move at a bounding gallop, or tends to be the movements we see in deer tracks and that deer do out in the wild. So based off of that, I can look at the prints that a deer leaves behind and then estimate how it was moving based on the tracks it left behind. If the tracks are evenly spaced and the deer looks like it was moving on 2 legs, I know the deer was moving at a trot. So it was moving at a pretty even pace, and from that you can estimate speed if you really want to go into it. But for the most part, just knowing how the animal was moving will give you a good idea if that animal was leisurely going through the woods or it was at a breakneck pace trying to either catch food or get away from something trying to catch it, which is part of the fun parts for why we want to know the speed. Because if an animal that was moving at a walk all of a sudden breaks out into a sprint, you know something's going on. And you might want to explore the environment to see if you can figure out why that animal all of a sudden started running. So as you can see, the prints to the left, the deer was moving a lot slower, even pace. The prints look more similar to a human trudging through deep snow, versus the deer to the right was putting a lot more energy into propelling itself forward. Think about human prints, human walking versus human running, and how there's a larger gap usually between the prints the faster the person's moving. Well, the same goes for the deer prints. When a deer is in this galloping, bounding type pattern, it's very hard to estimate the size of the deer since the gap in between the prints is usually a lot longer than the length of the legs because they're putting a lot more force into their bounding, jumping, gallop type motion. Additionally, another tip for when judging to see if an animal's going at a faster speed is looking at the footprint itself. This usually works better for lighter snow or even mud type situations. It's not as easy to tell in deep snow situations where the footprint gets buried by snow collapsing in on the footprint. What you're looking for is the toes being spread out farther, because usually when toes are spread out farther, the animal's either trying to speed up or slow down, they're trying to get more traction. Additionally, you're looking for that animal to be on its, quote, balls of its feet. So this usually means for deer and a lot of canine species and felines that they're going to be deeper on the toes because the animal's trying to push off and run faster. Because for a lot of animals, if it's deeper on the heel, that means they're trying to slow down. Think a human track runner. We run on the balls of our feet so that we can go faster, so that we're not having as much impact, so there's not as much friction between our feet and the ground. Same thing applies to animals. Otherwise, you can look at the deer prints that we've been viewing. The bigger the gap between these sets of prints, the faster that animal is going because they're pushing off more of the ground. This tends to be, though, for animals that move in more of a bounding, galloping type motion, when that's their fastest motion. Like I said, the big tip for estimating the speed of an animal is learning all the different ways that animal can move, and then what their tracks look like when they move in that way. It's pretty easy with things like a deer, but what does a porcupine or a raccoon running through the forest look like? What kind of prints do they leave behind? So a lot of this stuff you'll learn with practice and looking at lots of different tracks in the woods, but you can also learn it from looking at lots of examples in books or online to see what does a porcupine look like when it's running and what kind of prints does it leave behind when it's running. So if you want links to those type resources, check out my description below for those as well. So that's why tracking is really fun, because tracks leave behind a story in the woods, and by following them and learning how to identify them them and how the animal is moving and the size. You can learn a ton of things about that animal from its tracks. This is why I highly recommend doing tracking as a winter activity. It gets you outdoors, it gets you doing science, it gets your students and kids learning how to make observations, having fun, telling a story from the tracks that they saw in the woods, learning about the wildlife that they're tracking. Tons and tons of opportunities for cross-curricular learning, which is why I highly recommend it. Number 3, estimating how old the prints are. Now when I'm saying this, you are estimating for how long ago that animal left the prints behind. Now some things to keep in mind is it's very hard to get it down to a few hour marks unless you're tracking in something like mud that has been drying over the course of a certain amount of time. Now when it comes to tracking in snow like we're doing, the best you usually can get is it day of print, day before, or is it a few days or a week even old. Now how you do this is by being familiar with what kind of weather occurred in the last week. Did it snow? Did it rain? Was it really sunny and warm some days and there was a melt and things refroze? By having all this kinds of information readily available in your memory or on your phone or whatever, so it's information like this that will allow you to get a better idea of how old these prints are that were left behind. When it comes to actually estimating the age of the animal that left these prints behind, that gets a little bit tricky. In fact, it's almost a pseudoscience according to some people. But if you do know, say, the age class of the deer in your area, that deer of a certain age are usually a certain size, then perhaps you can estimate the age, but we're getting into the very, very highest reaches of tracking, things that I'm still even working on to this day. So in this video, we're not going to be going over how to tell the gender of the animal, how to tell how old the animal is. I'll save that for maybe a later video if I feel confident enough in how to teach it to all of you so that you can enjoy the information. So now back on topic with aging prints. A tip for practicing aging prints is to pick a day either after it snowed or after it's been warm for a few days. That way you can see what fresh prints in snow look like, or you can get a comparison of how the prints look after they've been out in the sun and the warmth for a few days. So here we have a great example of what weathering looks like with these prints. Notice how rounded these are looking on the edges. They're melty. They don't have very clear footprints anymore. There's leaves in them. So these prints are a lot older. So here we have side by side 2 different sets of deer prints. The ones to the left are a little bit older, as you can notice, because they're more weathered. They've been melted in the sun a little bit. Now if you look and compare to these over here, these are a lot more clear. There's more sharp and edges to them. You can see the powdery snow from where it broke the snow apart. It hasn't been worn down by the sun or heat or wind yet. Now a tip to help with aging the prints, to figure out how old the prints that were left behind are, is by leaving a footprint of your own next to the prints or a handprint and comparing to see how they look together. Does your print look fresher than it? Does it have more sharp edges? Is it more clear? Is there powder on the edges that hasn't quite fallen in and gotten warped into the shape? So just kind of compare and contrast until you kind of have an understanding for how a print that was made in the last hour should look versus a print that is 12 hours old, a couple days old, a week old. You get the idea. Compare and contrast. Use the resources that are available to you. Leave your own prints behind. Make a statement. Estimating the age of the tracks that were left behind is one of the hardest things that you can do, because it's something you can only learn through making lots of different observations and looking at prints and how they look in different mediums after different amounts of days and time, whatever the case may be. But it takes a lot of practice, and you'll get better at it with time and practice. So keep on getting out there hiking and tracking outdoors. Look at pictures online, watch videos like this one, and I promise you'll get a lot easier the more you do it. Part of the reason why estimating the age of tracks can be a really great skill to have and be so rewarding is because when you realize you have a fresh set of animal prints, you can then follow them, at least if you're in a place that you can do so and it's not dangerous. you can follow those prints and get some photographs of that animal and to maybe see that animal in person that you wouldn't necessarily get to see. The one and only time that I've gotten to see wolves out in the wild, I was up tracking in northern Minnesota, and I came across a fresh pair of wolf tracks, and I followed them through the woods across the field until all of a sudden I saw the wolves running through the snow across the field on the other side. And it was super amazing and just one of the best experiences ever. And the only reason why I got to have it is because I saw these fresh wolf prints and I was in a position that I could follow them. So this is why I highly recommend learning this skill, even if it's just to see a little red squirrel chasing another red squirrel around, or maybe to get to see a doe and her fawn running through the woods. This can be a great skill to have. Just make sure you're following good animal safety techniques and not getting too close. Make sure you're following the thumb rule. The animal's not so close that it's bigger than your thumb. That way you aren't likely to get hurt and you're not harming that animal or disturbing it. We don't want to stress these animals out. See the animal, get a photo, run away. Well, not run away, but you know what I'm saying. Go on, leave the animal alone, be on with your day and your business. Let them be on with their day and their business. Wild animals are not a part of a petting zoo. Do not try and touch them. Do not take bear selfies, please. I want you all to live to a ripe old age and get to see lots of animals, and you can't do that if you're not following good strategies and techniques for being safe around wildlife. No touchy. No touchy. No touchy. I mean, it's cool being able to tell how big an animal is or how fast it was moving, but with tracking, if you're able to tell that prints are a fresh pair of prints and you're able to see that animal in person, that's the part that I really enjoy the most about tracking. It's why it keeps drawing me outdoors. It's why I'm addicted to it, getting outside tracking, because I know if I can see a fresh set of prints, then I might actually get to see that animal in person, maybe get a picture of it, maybe get some film of it, or at least just have a fun day exploring and investigating and learning more about the wildlife around me. This is all reasons why I love tracking. So that's why I highly recommend you and your kids checking it out and trying it out for yourselves. Plus, it gets you outdoors in the winter, especially if you live somewhere with snow. So unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. Thanks for watching my video. I hope you liked it. If you did, make sure to subscribe below and ring that little bell button. That way you can be notified the second my videos are up on YouTube to help you and your kids get outdoors. As well as check out the description. I have links to tons of other resources like the ones mentioned in this video, links to my other tracking videos, links to tracking books that you might be interested in, as well as there's links to my email list and all my different social media accounts that you can join and follow, so that way you can receive daily and monthly tons of resources to help you and your kids get outdoors as well. Tons of resources. Check it all out in the description below. So as always, I hope you all have a fantastic week. You be safe, learn lots, have fun, and get outdoors. Bye. See you next week, Wednesday.
Hi, I'm Dingo. I like to eat food. Yum, 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 yum. Hello, I'm
Don't waste my film.
Dingo.